Do you see how it is possible that all of this, the entire history of religion, the entire history of the world, the entire history of the universe, and your entire religious life could have happened without God actually existing? As I read this question, my mind walked through all the arguments I had made for God throughout my life. I had always assumed that the reason my intercessory prayers were not answered with a supernatural frequency was because intercessory prayers contradicted with God's omniscience. I assumed that an omniscient God already knew what was best for me, and that it was me who needed to listen to Him, not the other way around. However, I could see how it was possible that my intercessory prayers weren't answered because there simply was no God there to answer them. I had always assumed that morality was independent of God because otherwise it would just be a meaningless expression of God's opinions. Because if that were true, God could command things like rape, murder, and child molestation, and they would become moral. I had always assumed that we discovered morality through reason and experience because God had given them to us. I assumed that God made it our responsibility to use those gifts to discover what was right. However, I could see how it was possible that the praiseworthy systems of morality that I learned about in my otherwise secular ethics class were independent of the concept of God because there simply was no God. I had always assumed that the reason I'd never encountered any devout Christians who later became atheists was because no true Christian who had seen the power of God with their own eyes could ever become an atheist. I'd always assumed that atheists were never true former Christians, but rather people who were ignorant of the Bible and what it meant to be a Christian. However, the professor knew more about the Bible than I did, and clearly understood every aspect of my Christian life that I had shared with him. He had been a devout Christian, as confident in his own faith as I was in mine, until he had met Ramon Menendez-Pidal. The professor was someone who clearly had been a true Christian, and clearly and fully understood Christianity, even valued it, and yet, through research and investigation, had rejected it. So I could see how it was possible that the reason so many people stayed Christian wasn't because there really was a God, but simply because they just didn't know about the things that the professor had shown me. I'd always assumed that the Bible's origins were unknown to academia, and that we had no reason to doubt that it had been inspired by God. However, through the documentary hypothesis, the professor had shown me that academia had made a well-documented and thorough study into the origins of the Bible, and had come to a consensus about precisely how much of it was put together using human reasoning. Among the evidence they found was a set of clear political goals that served very human purposes. So I could see how it was possible that there really was no God inspiring them, but rather that the Bible was just the result of their own human reasoning. I could see how it was possible that they only thought God was inspiring them, but in reality they were just subconsciously projecting their own personal or societal beliefs onto what they perceived as God in their own minds. I'd always assumed that my own experiences of a personal relationship with God were irrefutable revelations and perceptions of a God. However, I could see now how those experiences could be explained as simply the result of my own psychology. I could see how it was possible that I had simply been running a simulation of God in my own mind. And if both the Bible and the concept of God had come from human origins, then any of the logical arguments that Schroeder had made in his book fell flat. If these things came from humans, then Schroeder's arguments could be explained as coincidences, or like the professor had said, it could just be bad reasoning and he could simply be wrong. And when I looked closely at Schroeder's time calculation, I could see that it was off by a pretty large margin from the actual age of the universe. So I could see how it was possible that Schroeder's time argument could seem plausible without God actually existing. And I could see how it was possible that the entirety of creation existed without God actually existing, The very reason that I had originally needed Schroeder's book to comfort me was because none of the processes I had learned about in my physics or biology classes appeared to require a God to work. So of course I could see how it was possible that they simply didn't. So yes, I could see it. I could see how everything in the universe was explainable without a God actually existing. I could see how all the religious symbols and materials and experiences could have manifested without there actually being a God. I could see how it was all possible without a God guiding or creating or controlling anything. That is all it takes, the professor replied. What did he mean by that? This seemed like an obvious logical mistake to me. Just because it was possible that God didn't exist, that didn't mean God didn't exist. Just because I could see how everything could have happened without God existing, that didn't automatically mean God didn't exist. I'd known from the beginning of this conversation that it was possible that God didn't exist. This was nothing new to me. Yet, over the next few days, something happened in my mind. Somehow, walking through each of my core beliefs and experiences and appraising them fully, and specifically as being possible without God actually existing, had changed something about my perspective. Somehow, walking through each detail and seeing how I didn't need God to explain any of it had changed the way I saw things. What the professor was engaging in my mind was the concept of Occam's razor. Occam's razor states that, when faced with two opposing explanations for the same set of evidence, our minds will naturally prefer the explanation that makes the fewest assumptions. So if an event or process can be explained without an extra, superficial element, our minds will naturally shave that element away, using Occam's razor. For example, if I heard a loud bump in my closet, I may initially think there's some kind of animal in there, moving around. However, if upon opening the closet I discover that I'd left a box precariously close to the edge of the shelf, and that the box is now on the floor, I probably wouldn't think there was an animal anymore. Further, if I looked around carefully in the closet with a flashlight and didn't find an animal, or any evidence of an animal such as hair or claw marks, or any evidence that an animal had escaped the closet, such as a hole in the wall, I probably wouldn't think there was an animal there. In my mind, I have two opposing explanations. One is that an animal knocked the box off the shelf, causing the noise I heard. The other is that the box just fell off the shelf because of natural processes, like a lack of friction and gravity, or the fact that the shelf was tilted. If I wanted to go on believing that an animal had caused the noise, I would have to make assumptions that I have no evidence for. For example, I would have to assume something like the animal had quietly run out of the closet door as I opened it without me seeing it. The explanation that made the fewest assumptions, and yet still accounted for all the evidence I had, was that there simply was no animal. And so Occam's razor would automatically be used by my mind to shave the animal out of the explanation as an extra and unnecessary element. An animal was not needed to explain the events, and so there was no evidence motivating me to believe that there had been an animal in the first place. It was still possible that an animal had been there, but I had no reason to motivate me to believe that. And, the professor was implying, the same was true for God. Everything I had described to the professor was explainable using the natural world we all knew existed. So what motivating evidence did I really have for adding God as an extra element to the explanation? What motivating evidence did I have for thinking it was necessary to believe in God?